for the delay. We had Cirque run a little bit longer. I'll get Tracy if you would open with the Karakia. Thank you.
Kia ora, councillors. Whakataka tahau ki te uru, whakataka tahau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, ngā taratara tai, ki ake ana tatakura, kio, ki hauhu,
Thank you, Tracy. You will be aware that we have 11 reports coming to us today. Most of them are just receiving the reports, and we do have a decision on number 9, which is around the regional adaptation planning. What we're looking at today, it should travel fairly quickly. So we envisage being finished about 11:30, and lunch has been moved forward to 11:30. Apologies, I have an apology for Pamela, and I believe we have Katarina leaving early. Oh, fine. For lateness. Anybody else? Ms. Gold, I'll move they be accepted. Seconder. Thank you. Jennifer, all in favour? Sorry. Okay, so James has just alluded that Robbie is an amendment, so just coming in as. That's all good. Opposed? So carried. We're now looking for a confirmation of the agenda. I can have a mover. Thank you, Councillor Nicol. Thank you, Councillor Downard. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Are there any disclosures of interest that haven't already been put on the register regarding any of the items we're dealing with today? Take that as a no. Thank you. So our first item up on your pack, which is page 6. And that is a confirmation of the subcommittee minutes on the 2nd of August. Do you have any comments on those minutes or a mover that those minutes be accepted? Thank you, Councillor Nicol. I'm happy to second those. All in favour? Opposed? So carried. Our next item is the resource management reform update. That is on page 10 of your agenda. And so staff are going to work through this with us. Do you want to comment, Tracy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and for our councillors. So weeks ago now, we got the 2 pieces of legislation through the House, the Natural and Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning Act. So they were moved through the House at pace, I think it's fair to say. They are, yes, at pace. They are 2 pretty seminal pieces of legislation. I think councillors, you may recollect, we brought you in early in January to go through our submission and understand some of the significant changes that were being mooted. We now have the legislation. Ministry for the Environment admits that it perhaps could have done with a bit more time, a bit more finesse, but they were very keen to get it through the House. We have heard and we know that there is a big decision the country will make on October the 14th, and that may or may not influence these 2 pieces of legislation. So we've heard from different political parties their intentions with the bit of legislation, but we also know we will wait to see who the government is, how it's formed and what their priorities are. Importantly, there are some pieces that are enacted and that have been active from day one, and those have been highlighted in the report, and Lisette and Hannah will take you through that. One thing I would observe, having lived through a few new pieces of legislation being enacted. The Ministry for the Environment is doing a lot of work. The regional sector is doing a lot of work with implementation guidance. If councillors are interested in that, and we haven't bombarded you, but if councillors are interested, we're more than happy to send you the links to some of the documents we've got, or the relevant link on the webpage to that. But it is commendable that the government has understood the legislation's only as good as its implementation guidance. Staff are on a number of working parties. I've, for my sins, have been filling in and talking to a lot of people around questionnaires and interviews around what the system needs to support this change, particularly around capacity and expertise and what is in the system and what isn't, in terms of human resource, both for ourselves and others who have some fairly hefty responsibilities. So it is an information paper, but it's very important that you understand we now have these pieces of legislation. We are starting to look at them and unpick them, but we're doing that in a fairly judicious manner, noting that there may be forward changes. So Lizette and Hannah are going to take you through the high points of what we believe you need to know at this stage.
Thank you, Tracy. And yeah, just reiterating too that we are well aware that with the government elections coming up, things may change. So there isn't a lot of resource going to be pushed into this space in the meantime. The transition process is obviously over a 10-year period, and WRC isn't one of the first cabs off the rank. So just bear those things in mind. Thank you, ladies.
Morena koutou. Ko Hannah Craven tōku ingoa. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for Waikato Regional Council.
Hannah, can I just get you to bring that mic even closer? Sorry, so it's touching your teeth. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Right, so today, I guess I'll just give you a bit of a recap and bring you up to speed. As Tracy mentioned, government's been working on resource management reform since 2019, and at the end of last year, released 2 of the 3 components of the proposed reform for public consultation, these being the Natural and Built Environments Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill. You'll recall that Council lodged submissions on both of these bills in February this year, and these were presented to the Select Committee by our Chair and Chief Executive. The Select Committee then reported back to Parliament on the bills in June this year, having recommended amendments to the bills in response to submissions. The bills then made their way through the House and were passed and enacted into law on the 24th of August. I'll also just note that the 3rd piece of legislation, which is part of this reform, the Climate Adaptation Act, hasn't been released yet. We're expecting to see this maybe sometime early next year, although in the meantime, government is consulting more generally on hazards and adaptation. Slide, please.
Ben, did you have a question before we move forward? Or you want to?
I mean, Tracy, it's like we saw the submissions when they came through. Particularly, we questioned whether the bill was any less complex than current RMA and whether there was sufficient democratic accountability. But also, there did not seem to be complementary transformational funding available. Did any of that funding come?
I'll have a crack at that through the chair. So the first point was around, what was the first point? Sorry.
Basically, there wasn't any more.
Yes, so we saw some changes in the complexity. A lot of things were clarified through the Select Committee process. So that, I think, was the main area of change through the Select Committee process. However, the democratic accountability concerns remain. So there wasn't a lot of change to the makeup of regional planning committees and a secretariat being set up. Those fundamental things stayed. And in terms of funding available, the MFE had previously announced there was some in the order of some $1 million to assist with the transition, but only really for those first tranche regions, so to trial the legislative change. More broadly, any type of funding that we foresee and that cost that we foresee, we haven't had a satisfactory answer to, in my perspective. Tracy, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything further to
Regional
that.
planning committees.
So the funding and financing of the new legislation is in the regulatory impact statement. It is probably quite generic, so as to assist us as much as we would like. But I do appreciate that we are an agent of central government, a delivery arm. Ministry for the Environment have been very clear in saying while there are new constructs, they are removing the RMA. So the effort that we, that there definitely won't be a balancing out, I can assure you, but there will be some responsibilities that we no longer have that are now superseded. So that's part of the work that we're doing, going through, looking at what replaces business as usual, but what is actually an increased cost. That is something that the regional sector are very clear on in the session around those additional costs. There seems a bit of a paradox between the additional cost yet the decreasing of democratic accountability. They are definitely being, the best way I can explain it, they are being huddled through by Ministry for the Environment.
Thank you, Hannah.
Right, so this slide just gives a bit of a refresh of the key components of the new acts. I'll just briefly summarise these. So the biggest changes include the introduction of a national planning framework to strengthen central government direction on resource management issues, rather than the existing somewhat ad hoc collection of national policy statements and environmental standards that we currently have, and the issues that we encounter when these conflict. We have the introduction of environmental limits and targets for resources. These can be set at either a national or regional level. There's regional spatial strategies to set out the strategic direction and priority actions for a region over a 30-year period. The collation of existing regional policy statements, regional plans, coastal plans, and district plans into one combined natural and built environment plan for each region. And then, as already discussed, the introduction of regional planning committees as the decision makers of plans and regional spatial strategies. These will include representatives from local government, iwi/hapu, and central government. And overall, the biggest change perhaps in the system is a shift from planning to mitigate adverse effects to planning to promote environmental outcomes, which underlies the purpose of the bill. Slide, please. So this diagram shows where council's roles in the new system lie. You can see that while central government is perhaps more involved, having a role in those regional spatial strategies as part of the Regional Planning Committee, council's roles do appear diminished and partly overtaken by that Regional Planning Committee. Slide, please. So while the reform is proposed to occur gradually over a 10-year transition period, there are some changes which came into effect immediately following enactment. These changes particularly relate to consenting, including fast-track consenting processes and freshwater consents. Also some compliance monitoring and enforcement provisions, and parts on contaminated land and aquaculture. The consenting and compliance provisions particularly have had an immediate impact on council, and our Resource Use Directorate have been working to give effect to these. Slide, please. So as I mentioned, the transition period is still proposed to take 10 years, which, long as that may sound, is still potentially quite optimistic. As you can see on this diagram, the first step will be for regions to establish that regional planning committee, followed by preparing a regional spatial strategy and the natural and built environment plan. There will be a staggered approach for when regions start this process. It's not all at once, and at this stage it is still unclear which regions would transition first. The RMA will not be fully phased out until the last region has notified their natural and built environment plan. So in light of this uncertainty and the lengthy transition period, the work that Council is currently doing relating to freshwater planning, the MPSs for highly productive land and Indigenous biodiversity, etc., that's not going away. It is still business as usual for us until told otherwise, but we are cognizant of this upcoming change and starting to think about how these new entities and processes might work in the Waikato. And just to add another layer of uncertainty, as already noted by Tracy, there are dissenting views on the reform from different political parties. Some parties have announced they would repeal the Act if elected into government later this year and redo parts of the reform. So we are also conscious of that. That's the end of my presentation. Not sure if Lisette or Tracy would like to add anything. Otherwise, happy to take questions.
Couple of comments. We do have an effect from day one. As said, we've got been working through those because ultimately there's some consent holders who may be affected, and those consent holders are going to kind of know why they are impacted. And so we're just working through messaging around that. Predominantly it's focused on duration time, consent related, and we're only too appreciative of the investment that people make in those consents for a period of time. And if that is impacted, really understanding what the new provisions are in the Act. There are some inability, and we are looking at this particularly in regard to the long-term plan and how it plays out in terms of an increased ability to charge for permitted activity monitoring, but that is not it's not binary. There's a lot to that conversation. And also in regard to a couple more the compliance monitoring and enforcement section, we know Patrick Lynch and his team are looking through those new tools to actually make sure they have the right statutory hooks in the legislation. When legislation is written in haste, if you're going to use a tool in a compliance and enforcement space, you need to make sure it is 100% solid. So we're working through that at the moment. I do want to give council the confidence that we're not creating the wheel. Lisette and Lisette's team are very much dialed into the regional sector and the work that the regional sector is doing, because we don't want to replicate what 14 other councils are scratching their head about. As I said, we wanted to bring it to you. We aren't overinflating it at this stage. We have been very clear with government, we do not want to be one of the first. Government have been very clear with us that they don't want us to be one of the first because we are a rather complicated region. We also have our river settlement iwi in conversations with government to understand how the requirements that are in the river settlement legislation that follow through into joint management agreements, joint committees, how they are translated through into the new Act, understanding the new constructs. Regional Planning Committee is quite different to this council making a decision on a policy document. So my last conversation with MFE is they are still trying to navigate their way through that to make sure that nothing is lost and nothing is gained in the legislation, that it all works seamlessly. We're not there yet.
Noel, you have a question?
No. The legislation is prescriptive in some areas, but then it also says, and as a regional council, as the region wishes to determine for. So the legislation is descriptive and the representatives, that there shall be representatives each territory. However, you may want one, and then there must be representatives, iwi, tangata whenua of Interior. That has to be determined in a manner that best suits that. Elected voting committee or delegates appointed. And part of our submission, I know around the table, councillors were quite adamant that, hey, a person that we want that committee might not be a councillor, but that person would have to be a staff be advising them. Just a question around happening at the moment. There are a lot of conversations about potential. I think we all have to go through that learning, getting on the same, and then go. Lots of chatter, more learning.
Thank you, Tracy. Ben?
Tracy, I recall the water consents are now limited to 10 years. Is that the implication of that?
So it's a bit of a complicated timing. It depends on when your region notifies its natural and built environment plan, so that combined plan. The necessity is that water allocation consents do not go past that date, but it's very hard for us to know because we have not yet been told when we are beginning our transition, and therefore when we will have a complete regional spatial strategy that will therefore inform a natural and built environment plan that may take anywhere between 2 and 5 years to become notifiable. So this is the difficulty in us trying to find the right time frame for these water allocation consents to be allowed to continue until.
So it's not 10 years immediately from.
No.
You know, it's not. It is quite. Said, and that's what we're trying to step through and understand. As much for administrators of the plan as people with have time. What our present regional plan does is it gives an indication of when we will be reviewing allocation per catchment, just so that those who hold consent are aware. So we already have a bit of a half in our existing region, but this new legislation tips it on its head a bit, and that's what we just want to navigate through, being appreciative of the investment that many people have made in these.
Thank you, Tracy. Any other questions? So the motion before us is to receive the Resource Management Reform Update Report. Thank you, Karaina, and a seconder. Had a whole lot of hands, but thank you, Noel. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Thank you, Hannah. Lizette?
If I can just make some comment about the next two items. So the House Rose, they were powering through introducing new national direction. What these items are is to bring them to your attention, understanding staff are doing more work on them, but to formally have them brought to your attention. Some will require a significant amount of resourcing, others, depending on our roles and responsibilities, other national policy statements won't require as much. What I have seen is a a non-public draft of the new national planning framework, which is quite substantial. Working my way through that, and that will validate all these new national directions that we're seeing, along with our existing national policy that we've got on freshwater, etc. We won't see that till early next year. In the interim, we've got some pieces of national policy direction. This one that we've been waiting for quite some time. Next one that was kind of scurried through relatively hastily, but I'll let Alejandra and Judy overview this item.
Judy, I'll just get you to drag that mic in, thank you.
My name's Judy Van Rossum. This report gives a preliminary overview of the National Policy Statement for Indigenous. Closer? It looks at the impact on our biodiversity work program. So I'll just provide a 10-minute overview and then that you might have. So the NPSIB is a regulatory instrument under the RMA, and it also sits under the canopy of the New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy, or Te Mana o Te Tau, which is a whole of New Zealand biodiversity strategy. So the two documents are mutually supportive and have aligned implementation. Pardon me. Overall, the NPSIB aims to maintain Indigenous biodiversity so there is at least no overall loss. To do this, we need to work in partnership with tangata whenua and also engage with other stakeholders, including territorial authorities in particular, and landowners. The NPSIB covers all land types, and with some exceptions, it does not apply to freshwater ecosystems or the coastal marine area. We need to remember it directs councils, not landowners. So broadly speaking, the NPSIB requires councils to identify areas of significant Indigenous biodiversity, to manage any adverse effects on them from new development and surrounding activities, to work towards restoring important areas or features that have been degraded over time, to prepare regional biodiversity strategies, and it also requires us to monitor the condition and extent of biodiversity to understand what changes are taking place. Next slide, please. So there are 17 policies in the NPSIB, and this is just a kind of truncated version of them all. I'm not going to go through them all of them, but I'd just like to talk a little bit about a few of those policies. So starting with tangata whenua, so the NPSIB addresses the treaty principles by supporting aspirations of iwi, hapu and whānau who may want to develop their land, and recognises the role of tangata whenua as kaitiaki. So to put this into context in our region, if we look at all of the terrestrial Indigenous vegetation in the region, around 17% is on Māori land. And if you look at it the other way, so if you look at all of the Māori land in the region, which is around 260,000 hectares, nearly half of that, so around 44%, is covered in Indigenous vegetation. So this policy statement does have quite a bearing on Māori landowners. The NPSIB sets out a framework for councils and tangata whenua to work in partnership to manage biodiversity to the extent that they wish to be involved. The Ministry is developing a separate Māori implementation plan, which will identify specific measures to support hapu and iwi, and this is expected to be completed within the next 6 months. Moving on to just looking at changes to our plans. So briefly, much of the NPSIB aligns quite well with the Council's approach as set out in our regional policy statement. But our regional plan, given its age, will need considerable change to give effect to the NPSIB. And some of the areas that will need work include identifying the habitats of specified highly mobile fauna. So these are mostly bats and birds, and they're listed in the back of the IB in one of the appendices, the identification and management of taonga, and also Indigenous vegetation targets, just to name a few. We have begun the analysis of the NPSIB against the RPS in the regional plan, and this analysis will help us determine the size of the task and the resources required. Moving on to significant natural areas, or SNAs, all councils have had to protect areas with significant biodiversity under the RMA. The challenge has been that there's been a lack of guidance around what this means in practice, and the requirement has been inconsistently applied right across the country. The NPSIB has quite a focus on significant natural areas. It has one national set of criteria for councils to identify SNAs and provisions around how to manage them as well. The key thing is that the NPSIB directs territorial authorities to identify, map and schedule SNAs in their district plans. And in our region, our council has been undertaking that identification work. And we've provided this information as a data layer to the districts. And this is an ongoing exercise. So many of the TAs in our region already have SNAs scheduled in their district plans. So this is something that we are going to have to carry forward in discussions with our territorial authorities around whether they need us to continue doing that work, since we've already made such inroads into that identification exercise, and maybe looking at some kind of shared services. Actually. Moving on to consents. So SNAs are not the only places that are important for biodiversity. Councils will be required to maintain biodiversity outside of SNAs by managing the adverse effects using the effects management hierarchy. So that's the avoid, remedy, mitigate, offset, compensate hierarchy. Existing activities can continue, provided that their effects remain at the same level and don't increase the loss of native plants or animals in an SNA. So that includes pastoral farming and forestry. New development can still happen, but the NPSIB directs councils to require landowners and developers who want to undertake new development to avoid or manage any adverse effects their activities may have on biodiversity on the site. There are also some alternative management regimes provided for in the NPSIB that don't have the sort of 5 avoids or the effects management hierarchy as a key management tool. These are called carve-outs. The activities with their own management regimes are SNAs on Māori land, in plantation forestry, and also within geothermal ecosystems. For instance, with geothermal, we have our own regional classification system through our the regional biodiversity strategies. All regional councils will have to prepare a regional biodiversity strategy that sets out a vision for landscape scale restoration of Indigenous biodiversity. It has to be done in collaboration with territorial authorities, tangata whenua, communities and other identified stakeholders. And the NPSIB gives a generous time frame of 10 years for this. These strategies need to include things like promoting the restoration of certain priority areas, setting targets for Indigenous vegetation cover, identifying highly mobile fauna areas, providing for resilience to climate change, and just setting out actions and milestones and basically who does what, when and how it will be resourced. The regional biodiversity strategies are not confined to statutory requirements, so we can include freshwater and coastal marine biodiversity as well. Essentially, these strategies are intended to provide the same strategic vision at the regional scale that DOC will provide at a national scale through Te Mana o Te Taio. So this work's already being started here with the development of a biodiversity accord, and alongside this will be the planning for the regional biodiversity strategy over the next 12 months. Just the last policy I just want to talk briefly about is the monitoring policy. So regional councils must work again with tangata whenua, territorial authorities, relevant agencies and other stakeholders to develop a monitoring plan for Indigenous biodiversity in their region and each of their districts. Every monitoring plan must establish methods and timeframes for monitoring, including things like measuring the physical extent of SNAs, identified taonga, restoration areas, and again, the percentage of Indigenous vegetation cover in urban and non-urban environments in its region. So at the moment, Council does do high-level biodiversity monitoring, including indicators like extent of Indigenous vegetation on land, forest fragmentation. But to be fair, this current biodiversity monitoring falls well short of the obligations set out in the NPIB. So just looking at the last slide. So this is the timeline or timeframes for some of the key parts of the NPSIB. You'll notice that there are some things that do need to be put in place straight away, and that's particularly so for the consents. So in conclusion, the NPSIB does create a number of new responsibilities for Council. Fortunately, we already had a heads up through the previous draft versions of this policy statement. And just to make the comment that the additional workload that's resulting from this comes at a time when we have to go through substantial policy and planning processes to implement other national policy statements and pending resource management form. So our immediate steps are to complete that analysis of the NPSIB against our RPS and our plans, include and refine the resourcing and budget implications for Council's considerations, so through the long plan. And also the other thing that we are doing is preparing a submission on the biodiversity credit system, which is currently being consulted. And we will bring this to the, to the committee for approval at the end of October, early November. That's the end of my presentation. I'm not sure if Alejandro or Lizette would like to add anything.
Thank you, Judy. Clyde, I'll come to you first. Oh,
That's it.
yeah.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, SNAs. So council, is it regional councils that determine SNAs? Is it TAs? How does it work?
So the NPSIB directs territorial authorities to do the identification, and there's a set of criteria to guide councils to do that. But as I did mention, we actually have been doing that work ourselves for a number of years now, and we provided that to the district council.
Okay. And so it's an ongoing process, is it? We're not property owners sitting around the table, for example. They think they're out of the woods, but it's always an ongoing process identifying SNAs. If bats turn up on your property, suddenly you're in.
That's right.
SNA, okay. And can property owners challenge the SNA determinations?
Yes, they can. So there's a clause in the NPSIB that if there is disagreement, then the councils have to use the best information available at the time to determine significant natural area.
Just one last thing. If I had a plantation forestry, for determined as an SNA, and we're harvesting, is it possible that farming a particular one?
The policy statement does have these carve-outs for plantation forestry and also pastoral farming. So what that means is that those existing forestry activities can continue. So that's to cater for that
With
situation where
mitigation.
you've got harvesting of pine forests, potential impacts on an SNA. But obviously that, in terms of the harvesting activities, there still has to be assessment exercise around effects on the SNA, and there will be the conditions attributed to protect the SNAs.
I think feedback from public SNAs are a terrifying thing to have a letter box saying, hey, your property an SNA on it. What's the feedback?
So To date, because we've been doing this for quite a long time now, and we've been working really closely with the district councils to do this identification work. The district councils have been the ones that have contacted the landowners. So I would say most of the landowners in the region are significant natural areas because they would have had been contacted to date at some stage by. So this shouldn't be of any real surprise to them. The MPSIB does take into account that if you've got SNAs already scheduled in a district plan, then they remain as they are. It's when there are new ones, so that will another conversation with them.
And is a new one's common?
Yes, so sometimes they may be picked up through consent applications, or there's new aerial photography, for instance, that we've undertaken. So they do crop up. There are new ones crop up.
Thanks. Well, I'll come to Bruce and then Noel.
Well, look, thanks for that. That's a really comprehensive summary. Thank you, Judy. There was just the one point I wondered if you could give us a little bit more information on. It's item 27 under the heading Significant Natural Area Assessments. And in there you mentioned the 4 territorial authorities that have essentially done it. But what is the overall coverage of SNA for the whole region? So assuming that you've been involved in a good number of them, and I'm particularly thinking, for example, of the Waikato district. And what sense do you have of the proportion of our region where this process has essentially been undertaken?
So we've done assessments for 7 out of the 11 districts, and the other 4 districts have done their own assessments of SNAs. So this is where I'm about who does it. So as a proportion, do you mean like percentage of the vegetation, or?
No, I mean of where we actually have the information on SNAs for the region.
Right, okay. So we do, even with those 4 districts that have done that work themselves, we still have that information. So we, as the regional council, basically holds master data significant in all of the districts in the
But then not in all cases have the SNAs been scheduled. That's the
Correct.
issue, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So
Each of there is in that South Waikato truth every SNA other count it as a some are scheduled in those district plan, others have the district plan, others have chosen schedule, been active participants in those discussions, and sometimes even appellants. So there is, considering when I started here 2 years ago and the effort been invested, everybody has an SNA assessment. Some of those I suspect will likely need to be revisited based on the criteria in the MPSIB. We've had criteria regional policy 16, which is been tested through the courts, but as we'll appreciate, these things will change over time. And SNAs used to have a classification of 1 and 2, 1 being really important, being not as important, still important. That will change with climate change and the pressure that are being put. So I think really is we have done a lot of the work and in partnership with our PAs, but we are going to have to go back through, just check the robust.
Yeah, so just the final part to it then. So obviously there's going to have to be some sort of rationalisation of the existing SNA criteria and the new ones that are published in the National Policy Statement, although there is a very strong alignment, massively strong alignment. But are you going to be in a working group or something? Is this going to be done cross-council across New Zealand? How's it going to be done?
That's actually quite a good question, because I'm not sure whether whether MFE is going to facilitate something like that. But through the biomanagers group, which is hosted by security managers and the regional council, definitely been a conversation in terms of looking carefully at the criteria, our criteria and the IB. We've already started that, and it's quite it's quite a tricky exercise, because the MPSIB criteria are quite broad in places, as you've probably seen. So, as ours are quite specific. So we just have to be careful that our SNAs that we've captured in our policy statement through our criteria are not a subset of what we captured through criteria in giving effect. That's something that we phase out.
Thank you. No, that's fine.
Just
There's
to
a
add
fair bit of
that-
work to go.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
there's a lot of work.
definitely. The policy manager, special interest, having the conversations as biomanager, so at regional scale, trying to be as efficient as possible. But as Judy's alluded to, the devil's in that detail.
Thank you.
Oh,
Questions, if I may. I'll start with the first. In last or penultimate regions, nation.
So it varies from district to district.
No, but I'm
So
talking about the region.
the whole region.
Let's last one there. Percentage of indigenous. Steve, at least.
I couldn't. I'd have to get back to you on that one.
I think it's
Not sure of that.
27.
Oh, 20. Yes, sorry. If you're looking at the whole region, 27% of the land area is terrestrial vegetation.
But that's across the region. And let Judy answer the rest of the question, but 27.
Already.
Yeah.
So,
No, but Noel, it's about context.
yeah, and that's what I'm trying to understand. I'm not wanting numbers. And okay, this week I received a plan. Aren't out. Are we at risk of the landowner? Many landowners. Hunting program. Yeah. Because I think a lot of the SNAs were identified with aerial photograph, desktop exercise, sent out to the playground through. Somebody went out. Other aerial.
So would it be a disincentive to planting?
Well, that's probably
question?
driven by-
I don't see it like that, because the SNA identification work is an ongoing exercise. So every 5 years there will be new SNAs cropping up. But also having an SNA on your property doesn't mean that isn't always a negative thing either. It actually can mean that there are a number of incentives available to protect those areas with fencing and planting grants and that. As you know, we do that through and other organisations as well. So yes, there is a possibility that newly planted areas may become down the track. So I'd hope that the landowners, that there are plenty of benefits to the planting that wouldn't deter them potentially being an SNA in the future.
Thank you, Noel. Couple of really out of the box questions, Judy. I did notice some work that was done around trout and deer. Where did that end up? Did this come in?
Not sure I can answer that one.
Okay.
So
So probably Indigenous, but we're incredibly strong and have managed to still secure it in the new acts as it was in the old acts, but it's definitely
So it hasn't come into Indigenous
not into
biodiversity in any
NPC
shape or
as
form.
is.
Okay.
No.
this doesn't cover freshwater and freshwater.
Okay, no, thank you. Robbie?
I support what Noel was saying, because just an integrated catchment, you've got to be very careful with planting, and in the end, there actually ends up being a cost of going and cleaning drains that we've thought about the impact of that could cause in the future. So it has to be looked at as a whole catchment thing, where that's fine, that stuff can happen, but you've got to still realise, like we've sort of done down in on Spring Corridor, that the value of that still got to be able to do this as well, and the catchment still has to be able to do its function and work without getting a consent to go through something that an area that's planted. That you look at it as like as a wetland, it may need a consent in the future, and we're going through that at the moment. It's $100,000 to get a consent. So I just think those things need to be taken into place. What about?
Visible. So we as a council,
I might be penalised. So and we've discussed that at length, actually writing the rule in terms of land use into the, but when we go through change to our region, looking at, there are some exemptions in the B for specific structure. We haven't unpicked that, but definitely once we get into the development side, aware of this, don't want to be to do the about how that can outcome and hope biodiversity strategy, which is it's going to be interesting submission that we'll bring back to this to November.
Tracy, Stu?
Just a couple of comments. and just noting your concerns about the Waikato district, parents know, and I hasn't gone unnoticed that you're. We had a very constructive process in Waipa district. I had about my farm better to say, give us a call. Give them a call, and ended up taking all 4 of them out. But Tony Roxburgh came around and said, no, one of them I think would now, and I'd be quite happy because it's got, and I just, there's just nothing else I can put a land. But I guess just in hearing, acknowledge the concerns that some based in I know, I suppose that we just need to keep ourselves really well informed, and we are not fueling the wrong message going forward. I guess the only general question I've got is, am I correct in, and I've got to, areas that aren't covered by SNA or I mean, we've got thousands of hectares. I mean, that zero pest control, and I drive past some down my way, like 5 because you never go back into grassing because of the cost for money to that stuff that's not significant outside of this program.
So it does cover, the NPIB does cover biodiversity outside of SNAs, and that's where the effects management hiring. So it's the avoid, remedy and mitigate, but it's not so strongly on the side.
At the end of the day, we need.
Right, if there are no other questions, the motion before us is that the report, so moved. Second. Thank you, Stu. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Righto, our next report being presented is on page 25. That's around the National Direction for Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Industrial Process Heat. We have Alejandro and Annika.
When our tech committee, I can see that all the faces online are. Karakoto, my name is Alejandro Fuentes, Team Policy Implementation. This report, Annika Hamilton, to bring you an overview of what we have in terms of the national direction for gas emissions. There is a national policy statement, national environmental standard, are essentially the result of the Resource Management Act 2020 to repeal sections 78 and 100 that restricted the ability of regional councils to consider the effects of climate change resource discharges from gases, which is something that we control. I'll bring your attention to paragraph 2 of your report. That is in a nutshell what the MPS and the NEM. It is phasing out existing coal boilers by 2037. So this is in line with the emissions reduction plan target and the target government, and to stop the installation of new low to medium temperature industrial coal. This means that we're making resource consent conditions regional now have to and have regard the potential of these gases, which some of the activities have been put in the regard. The MPS requires amendments to the regional plan, so this is in line with what Judy was mentioning of the have to do in terms of responding to national direction. However, these changes are to be done without following the Schedule 1 process, so there'll be 65 of the RNA, and it contains a policy warning that must be included by every regional council in its plan. There's no specific timing in the MPS for this. However, the policy section already working on understanding the work required to carry out this change. And I understand that there will be a further report related to this Section 50 process that will. One key point that we noted in our submission to National Tools for Development was the resourcing and support that region undertake this new responsibility. So it's something that we unfunded mandates in several submissions, and it's essentially any new responsibility carries with it and on constrained resources that we have. Now, in the points that relate to the actual implementation of the energy efficiency already are developed plan, which is a key part of actually presenting decisions that we have to environmental standard rules. It'll be done in two parts. One part is for industry on how to gas emission plans. The other part will be for councils and authorities on how to interpret the plan, the suitability of the plan. The commencement date for both the National Environmental Standard and the National Policy Statement are 27th of July, which means now being that it is a National Environmental Standard, that means from the date of its commitment, we have to make decisions.
Alejandra, if I can interrupt you there, we're just got a comment she would like to.
So I just wanted to just to reiterate the matter that Annika and Alejandra have got on graph 18. So we will bring to you in November a plan change to our regional plan. It is what we are required to put in there. It won't be open to public submission. I mean, this MPS is quite specific. It's not as, I guess, seminal and foundational as freshwater or Indigenous biodiversity. It is quite related to a specific activity. So we will bring that change to the regional plan of those matters that we must put in. We are not planning to change the regional plan any more than just be the bare minimum, because the NES is already in operation that has that direction for consents. So in terms of keeping our resourcing focused on freshwater and coastal, any further changes to the regional plan will be dovetailed in at a later date. So just wanted to, in case you're thinking, crikey, are we going to be initiating a whole new plan change? No, we'll just be changing the bits that we are directly directed to change. Anything else will wait till later.
Thank you, Tracy. And just to close, National Environmental Standards. So this is what affects the consenting activities that we do at the council. Very plainly put, it is making now permitted activities is going to change in and activities. So this is for coal fuel machines that are just for industrial process heat, and then for some others that are non-coal. What it does is it brings in line, like I said, the decision to phase out the use of 37. So this is national direction following the emissions reduction plan. And then any permitted activity, any existing regional plan will remain permitted until January 20. Essentially, the amount of time that industry will have to comply with the environment. After that, any existing activities as permitted will have to get a resource consent under the condition. Happy to take questions now.
No?
Chair.
And number 4, I know it's
Yep, Noel's hanging out till the next item. So are there Are there any other questions on this item? Second, thank you. We have a mover in Mikhail and a seconder in Jennifer. Tracy, you wanted a closing?
Yeah, just comment. So this dash players in our, so they have been in engagement with governments. It applies to a handful at larger industry, and they are fully aware.
Answers my
Thank you. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Thank you, team. Go, they're gone then. Take my job.
So councillors, the next item here, workshop that we week, information is here, and based on developed Leandro through the report, but this is really taking the direction that workshop, and there will be next step this meeting and go to from there. Leandro.
Thank you, Tracy. So mentioned this with that we have. Planning river is most leaving any panel recommendation. However, we have outlined a set of principles. Yes, council, but is in working in the adaptation. Seven X. I won't read them all, but one thing that I community panel recommendations report pages have assessment and analysis. Okay, so the third option is that if the report the reason what we've done recommendations report was weather events. Now is taking it. Then that's step one, step in the process. So as will receive a and so that's the one actions, and then that will be in terms of possible and the very well if the now in terms of the next step, as I mentioned, so that's fine. That's in a nutshell. Next week, and that is council will receive a draft recommend to that's the pointed out let us calculate the information actions something not necessarily follow legal process under now on basis.
I'll come to you first, Noel, as
Thank you.
you were that keen.
For jumping the-
Good.
3 and 4. A-B, comma. That to clarify. Are not listening to the B that territory A to
As one step shop.
initially. In cut, paste and send. They could be inserted. Either way, I'd like.
Jen,
Yep, no, that makes. I'd be happy to second it. I would move 3 and 4. Not important. I got a bit confused. Recommendations report. That's the biggest. That's a big part of the reason. The next part is because that is the first chance whole council gets, and then that awareness of what I think that by putting the option one, which as a result, option 1 about running before the recommendation to leave for now. Because what will happen next is that we will go, they'll come back to us as a final
ask community and then often on, but it is at the same time really important. I don't know here at the time, and I don't want out of this that comes got there. So yeah, right. The principles that expand because it talks local authority, something that does that leave it open that if others are paper. We'll have that detail. Thank you.
Ben?
Yeah, my concern in sitting on this actions, very significant, which is a rural back property, back to people, etc. And that's fine if we have a discussion about that. I think it's important. Council participation and action mentions necessarily. Felt as though some of it was question I had was Karakia District was funding 90,000. Run up some funds. Are there any budget going phase?
Some costs, but they were as budgeted. Natural hazard was part of natural hazard doing anyway, so it's in addition. There are no ongoing costs specific to this. If there were, they'll be specifically identified. I say that before asked that we had very clear on direct costs. I think from memory there was additional $20,000 from the integrated catchment management budget provided. So we haven't provided any other than that. That is excluding staff time. That's all now business operation.
I mean, the Karakia community good, just it does see how this thing. I'd just like to.
I think that message is going through loud and clear now, Ben, and as you indicate, this will be one of a number that will now come towards us, but with having those principles, and I think staff are actually recording them and understanding where we were trying to get to, because they do reflect exactly what we spoke to in that workshop. Chris.
On a similar line, just type in a number, our cost should recover.
So if there's no other comments, we have a mover in Noel and a seconder in Jen as to how it's recorded once that A is inserted. Yeah, all those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Thank you, Leandro. Right, our item 10, which is on page 248, is our long-term plan project update. Haven joining us for that.
Yeah, good morning. So this is the regular LTP. Track and budget and work recently, which that conversation. Those additional specific workshops as well. So happy to speak to.
Starting to line up, so Ben.
Managers of review. Council.
Someone who has spent the last weeks going through his line, in-depth stations, have that information. It is not line by line. We still to go through the appreciate there is still a lot coming system, but we have done that. And Janine set the we've and we tested out the duration. So you will see the outputs of that detail this case process.
Thank you. I became and asked for that. By We were told you.
Yes, and we will endeavour to keep the meeting notes.
Thank you, Hoban. Are there any other questions for Hoban? So we have the motion to receive the 2024-34. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mikhail. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. You haven't. Our last item on the agenda for today is a submission update, I believe. Yep, submission summary update.
Thankfully, the government kind of took their foot off the accelerator of throwing things out for submissions in their last month. So there haven't been that many. There was, you'll recollect, councillors, a discussion maybe at the last committee meeting on stock exclusion regs and a submission to that. Staff did not put in a submission. One was not prepared under delegated authority. It was a very technical matter. We relied on the submission that was placed in by the regional sector representing all regional councils, just fixing up some of the technical pieces. Make that clear. The general position of the sector was, how can I put, please MFE sharpen up the clarity of what you're looking for in the stock exclusion regs and the connection in between some of the cross references of those. I can fish that out for you.
Lunch won't be ready yet. No, we have Alejandro's about to deliver.
Thank you.
I'll keep it very brief anyway, but this is a regular update. Vote is just apps in front of have the special representative. So that's it. District. In attachment 2, you have
Do you have any questions? I just got just one, just one really quick one, and it's just for my own information. In the Matamata Piako one, that can change 50 the Kaienga, the Matamata require consents under RMA for that primary purpose zone. It's just something I've never come across or heard of before. I'm just interested in, and I see different districts handle it differently.
you are correct. In terms of the plan, creating fit for purpose. Just to note, some of the back around this good, bearing in mind the Papa. You are correct. It's a April Papa. Rule set that will be.
Yeah, I was just at how that tied in back with the RMA, etc., and obviously our natural and built environment with excellent. Thank you. If there are no other questions, we do have a mover in Noel and a seconder in Jen. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Yes, I believe that brings us to the end. So James, if I can call on you for the, you can, oh, sorry, yes.
Una here, my team. Papanui, Ia Wātia, Kia Mama, Inako, Titiana, Ihinago, I Te Ara Takatu, Korea Ra Irongo, I Whakakaria, Aka Kirongo, Ia Tina, Tina Humie, Huie, Taikie.
Lunches will be here at 11:30, so you can amuse yourselves 10 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for all coming along well prepared. The meeting is closed at 11:07. We have it.